One of the ones that concerned me the most was the death of our Commerce Secretary several years ago on a mountaintop in Yugoslavia, where the hostess, the Air Force hostess on the plane survived because she was sitting on the jump seat in the back, and a certain British group went in there first, and she was alive and healthy when she left the mountain, and she got down to the airport, she was dead. And she only had minor bruises. And somebody needs to look into the influence that certain British commando units have and their cross-pollination with other groups like them in the United States. But what was even stranger was that his body made it back to Dover Air Force Base, Senator Brown. Secretary Brown. And they discovered that there was a bullet wound in the top of the head, about the diameter of a .45, and that a preliminary x-ray indicated that there were shavings of some sort inside the brain itself. And that yet he was raced out of that into a crematorium literally within a day, so nobody could do a serious autopsy. And the people at Dover in the Air Force Base there were severely chastised for even doing what they did voluntarily. But in the profession, there is a way of doing this with frozen CO2 bullets or nitrogen bullets. And there is no residue left except what the shattered pieces of the skull cavity. And this is of grave concern to a lot of us because this seems to be an ongoing process, particularly in the last 10 years. It's become very blatant across the entire spectrum of our government, nationally and internationally. And I think we all can just follow the web tracks these days as to where the implications are for that. And the needs for continuing control are getting more severe, and the use of these mechanisms is becoming ever more blatant.
So where do you think this is headed? I mean, what are your concerns about where we're headed?
My concerns are for the freedom of our country and of the free world. It sounds rather simplistic, but we have to have a philosophy upon which we base our lives. And my philosophy is that the Republican form of government, if we can get back to it in some way, shape, or form, is the strongest form of government ever developed by man, by basically allowing one event to occur, and that is that we allow everybody to become a sovereign individual. It's been proven in the last 200 some years, particularly from the technological development we've experienced since the founding of this country, that to a great extent has been focused first in the United States. That is the most motivating type of mechanism we can possibly have for our species to advance. And yet there seem to be countervailing forces trying to stop it. And if we don't find ways to neutralize these negative forces, we're going to find our lifestyles, our concepts of life as a species, nullified.
You've mentioned over the course of this interview a few which patients do you think are heavily involved in this whole effort, agencies and corporations?
Steve, if you look at what layers of influence we have here, either at government or corporate level, I would say that at the corporate level, we have to look primarily first. If you're talking about new propulsion technologies, we would first only look to the aerospace industry. I've had deep discussions with some people over a long period of time who either they or their fathers had worked for various aerospace companies and had been directly involved with the research as far back as the early 50s, on into the 60s, and then by the 70s they felt they had overcome most of the problems in reverse engineering technologies from what, interestingly enough, they do never call UFOs, but they call AVCs.
What does that stand for?
Alien Visitation Craft. And that means they know who they are. It's just the question is, what's the color of their skin, if you want to use a generic term. But that these firms, and you can name them, they're all the top 5 in the nation. They're all involved in it, in one degree or another, and they have their black within black. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't find in another few years that a lot of these firms have divisions that are even darker than the skunk works. and that one was almost a front for primary work in deeper divisions. And we have other divisions of the government. There was so much in the way of how long did the NRO run before anybody even knew they are operational. And then we get to the point where they're building their own headquarters in Virginia for almost $800 million, I believe. And nobody even knew they were spending the money on their new giant headquarters, which would have actually been larger almost than the headquarters for the CIA. So we have a situation here where somebody is not doing due diligence at the public level and at the government level in monitoring what's going on. You know, would you invest in a company without researching it properly to see if your investment is well placed? Well, we have people in the public and in our government that are simply not doing due diligence and upholding their oath of office for finding out what's really going on with our own government.
Well, then that brings to another question. What about the Fourth Estate and the media? You would think that they would want to investigate these issues seriously instead of just ridiculing them.
The subject, Steve, of the media, from my viewpoint only, it's a personal viewpoint.
It's okay.
Because I'm not intimately involved with the media on a day-to-day basis like some of the other people you've interviewed. As one of having been in to a degree and looking at the outside and seeing it as a total manipulative process with the media. They have their own agenda, and it's very liberal. We know which way they would generally vote if you did a Gallup poll on the media. We have an alternate media that is much closer to the truth, particularly on the web these days, but is purposely ignored. Anything of a serious nature is laughed at or neutralized as much as possible. A perfect example is the recent elections in this year of ours, 2000, where we have legitimately 4 or 5 people running for president, and they would never even have the debates cover other than the main 2 largest parties. That's a control mechanism that's rather blatant. If the people were really given a fair shake as to what's going on, we would have had all of the presidential contenders at each of those events on TV. I believe there were 3 of them. And we would have equal time in the newspapers and in the weekly news journals. So from the most mundane to the inobvious, it's obvious that the media is manipulated heavily. And I would hate to be a White House correspondent and say something against the president and find the next week my credentials are yanked. So you just have that happen once, and everybody there knows the limits to which they can go. But this is now happening throughout our system, not just in the government, in corporate reporting too. CNBC is a prime example of only saying nice things about corporations to keep their stock up, and hence keep the cash flow going into the advertising dollars going to CNBC. It's a bottom line problem.
What do you, I wanted to ask a question about this event near Pope Air Force Base, going back to the very
Yes.
beginning. How large and what shape was this object?
The object, when it first appeared as a white flat disc. And what was strange about it was the whitest white I had ever seen. Either of us had seen. At its closest point, it was 300 feet up and about 50 feet straight line up from us, over a tree line of pine trees, away from the lake. And it was a perfectly flat white disc of pure, even white light. You could sense there was a body above it, a round structure. The diameter was in that 35, maybe 40-foot range. And it did not wobble. It was dead steady, and it was moving along, almost coasting, like you would skip up something against smooth water, just like it was running on glass.
Silent.
Totally silent, and it went at about 25, 30 miles an hour. It was almost like it was a tourist, just watching the pretty lake we were at. But it has an effect that we looked at our watches when it happened, and we looked at it again when it left. So we know there was no missing time. Yet it had an effect that we were unaware of on all the wildlife around us. And obviously they have an ability to sense something that we as Homo sapiens have no ability to sense. And it bothered them enough that they went quiet. And it was eerie because in the South, in the summer, with the high humidity, sound travels for a mile or two. You get a bullfrog growing, you can hear them a mile or two away easily. And what was interesting was that the sound within earshot went silent, not just in the immediate area. And there are other old sand lakes. This was one of those old sand quarries been turned into a recreational lake. And what interested me most was the fact that what effect this had on the wildlife was able to penetrate out beyond our ability to pick up the sound, which meant a mile or two away. So as it moved along, it had an effect on the insect life and whatnot that moved with it.
Anything else you'd like to share?
Not at this time.
About your experiences?
Not at this time.
Good. Well, it's great timing. We're right at the 1 hour mark. I've got a few seconds left. That's why I was asking you. You probably see that's flashing.
Yep.
Yeah. But it's still recording. Trying to think anything else. The gentleman you worked with at first in Denver from Hughes and Martin Marietta, did they have any information or knowledge about the UFOs?
No.
Reverse engineering?
No. That was primarily intelligence data. They were working on spy satellites in one aspect, and the other one was working on the electronics for receiving the spy data.
Okay.
And that was their specialty. And we just used them. They were brought in because of their high-end electronics knowledge.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Steve.